think we can go ahead and get started.
Sounds great. Thanks, Hannah. Hey, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Greg Goodland. I'm the Public Affairs Officer for the Rio Grande National Forest. I'd like to welcome you to our today's installment of the Forest Specialist Series. I think we've got a fun one coming here and a great guest. So we're going to do a little bit of housekeeping things to get started. And
Got in finally.
I'm going to pass that over to my wonderful colleague Hannah from San Juan Mountain.
Oh, sorry, Greg. I think you got cut off there. That might have been my bad, but
You did.
um,
So I'll reintroduce Hannah Fake from San Juan Mountains Association, who is hosting the Forest Specialist Series on their Zoom platform. And Hannah, take it over with some good housekeeping things for us.
Thanks, Greg. So I am Hannah. I'm the Visitor Information Coordinator for the Rio Grande National Forest. I'm based out of the Divide Ranger District in Del Norte. So our Forest Specialist Series is a once monthly online program that we do to share information about the Rio Grande National Forest with our local community and beyond. So this program is put on in partnership between the Rio Grande National Forest and the San Juan Mountains Association. So we'll have about a 40-minute presentation with our specialist and then a question answer session afterwards, but feel free throughout to put any questions you have in the chat or just shout them out. Kevin would love to take questions throughout the presentation. So if you have a question, you can either just turn yourself off, unmute yourself and share it, or you can always raise your hand. So that's in the little, you click on the reactions. There's a raise hand button there at the bottom. That's a little smiley face and then the raise hand. The mute and video is on the left-hand side. If you'd like to message in the chat your question, you can click the little chat bubble. And you can either message to everyone or just a single person by clicking the blue drop down to select who you would like to message. So before we get started, we do have a door prize today, courtesy of the San Juan Mountains Association. We have a guidebook on trees. It's a little pocket book. Let's see if I can get it to come through. And of all the native trees of Colorado, as well as a San Juan Mountains Association water bottle. And there is another book in that gift bag as well. So if you'd like to be entered in the drawing, please put your name in the chat or message me your name directly, and I will enter you into that drawing. The winner will be announced at the end. And if you would like to stay up to date on our programs that are going on with the San Juan Mountains Association and the Rio Grande National Forest, you can send me your email and I will add you to our email list so you can stay up to date on everything that's going on. So you can always just drop that in the chat, click the drop down for and select my name. I'm Hannah, the BIS coordinator. And I think that's kind of all of our housekeeping things right now. So this month's topic is forest management. So we're going to hear all about that from Kevin Duda, who is our timber program manager. And so I will hand it off to Kevin for him to introduce himself a little further.
Hey, thanks, Hannah. And can you enable screen sharing for me? I'll get my presentation pulled up. Introducing, yeah, so welcome. Thanks for joining us this evening. I'm Kevin Duda. I'm the Forest Timber Program Manager. As Hannah said, I work out of the office here in Del Norte. And I know forestry is a pretty broad topic. I'm going to share my screen. So okay. Yes. So I know forestry is a pretty broad topic and there's probably a lot of rabbits we can chase. And so as Hannah said, this isn't a real formal presentation. So by all means, if you have questions as I'm going through the presentation, feel free to jump in and ask questions. My plan here is to kind of give a surface level overview of the planning process and the framework that we use to decide where to implement management and what type of management activities to implement. I'll show some photos that are associated with some typical classes of activities that we work on the forest, and then hopefully from there I'll save a lot of time so that we can have some good question and discussion at the end. So with that, we'll start out with just a brief conversation about what forestry is and what we're talking about for forest management, so that we have a common understanding. As we're moving forward through this, I'll have a few slides on what the forest, like what types of activities the forest typically implements and where those activities occur, and what framework guides where those activities occur. So digging into forestry and forest management, generally speaking, forestry is considered to be, the science and sometimes maybe the art of developing, caring for, and cultivating forest. And more traditionally, it's kind of viewed in the context of growing trees to produce a yield of forest product and timber products. Forest management is really closely related to forestry. Forest management is putting forestry more into practice. So it's a combination of a variety of principles. So policy principles, that's one of a big heavy part of federal timber management on the U.S. Forest Service lands. The biological, physical, economic constraints that we're faced with, and we package all those and then move forward to think about how are we going to regenerate, manage, utilize timber products, and conserve forests so that we get a benefit for the most people over the long run. And a key I underlined in this definition is we do all that to meet specified goals and objectives. And we'll have some more slides on this, but for our purposes, a forest plan is what we use as kind of our guidepost and assigning different goals and objectives to project areas. And so we'll keep that in mind. And so if you guys have questions as we're going through on like how we frame projects and what types of goals we're trying to achieve, we can touch on that a little bit more as we're going along. So basically we're talking about actively managing forest using some of our scientifically grounded practices to achieve specific outcomes. And I guess to touch on this a little bit more, there's usually not one like a right or a wrong way to manage forest. And so as an example, when we use the term a healthy forest, to some people that might mean a forest that's producing a lot of wood fiber, there's no insects and disease in there. To other people, a healthy forest might mean that you have all the whole suite of native insects and diseases functioning in their natural role. Neither one of those is right or wrong. What we use to compare that against is, for our example, maybe in wilderness areas, we want the whole suite of things working together in their natural function. In other areas where we're trying to produce timber products, maybe we're going to manage to not have so many insects and diseases. So that's just kind of an example of how those things are related to each other. So where does the work occur? The Rio Grande National Forest, for those that might not be familiar, is about 1.9 million acres, depending on how you calculate it, if it's, all the federal lands or the exterior footprint. And so within that footprint of the Rio Grande National Forest, we're guided by a variety of laws and regulations. Kind of the fundamental of those is the Forest Service Organic Act, which was put in place in 1897, and that established the forest reserves, which would later roll in to be part of the National Forest System. And that act had two primary purposes. One was to secure favorable conditions for water flow, and the other was to furnish a continuous supply of timber to be used by the people of the United States. Since then, there have been a variety of other laws that have been passed, such as the Multiple Use Sustained Yield Act, in 1960, which kind of expanded the scope of the variety of things that the forest system should be managed for. We had the National Environmental Policy Act in 1969, which applies to all the federal government, and it's intended to ensure that the government makes informed decisions, analyzes and discloses the environmental effects of federal actions. We've had the National Forest Management Act in 1976, which I have highlighted here. I've got this fancy laser pointer. And so the National Forest Management Act is one of the primary statutes that governs the administration of the National Forest System. And in part, what it does is it requires each National Forest unit to develop a land management plan or a forest plan that provides a programmatic high-level framework for what types of activities can occur and where those activities occur out on a landscape. And then kind of moving down through this hierarchy of laws and regulations and documents, when it comes to implementing site-specific projects, each of those projects is consistent with the framework laid out in our forest plan, and it's analyzed pursuant to the National Environmental Policy Act to make a site-specific project decision. So another component of the forest plan process, the planning process, is this determination of a suitable timber base. And so what the suitable timber base is it's the end result is site-specific, like stand level, kind of small vegetation polygons that have a common unit that may be in scale individually, range from maybe 5 or 10 acres up to a couple hundred acres in scale. And each of those areas is assessed for consistency and availability for timber management against laws and regulations to make sure we're consistent with that managing for the purpose of timber production would be consistent with forest plan desired conditions and objectives for a given management area. We want to make sure that we're not going to have irreversible resource damage. And then when we're talking about timber production purposes, we want to make sure that if we do a final regeneration harvest, that we have the knowledge and technology available to ensure that we can restock those areas within 5 years after that harvest. So the suitable timber base is used in a couple of different ways within the framework of our forest plan and regulations. One way that it's put to use is in our calculation of our sustained yield limit, which represents if the Forest Service were to manage the entire suitable timber base for the purpose of timber production, it's how much volume we could produce on an annual sustainable basis from those lands. The other way that it's used is it constrains where timber harvest can occur for the sole purpose of timber production. So we can implement forest management activities that harvest timber and forest products on lands that are not suited for timber production, but those need to be for the primary purpose of achieving other multiple use management objectives, such as wildlife habitat improvement, maybe fields reductions, things like that. So we can't just go out onto lands that aren't suited for timber production and say like, hey, we're going to go propose a timber harvest in this area, generate logs just for the sole purpose of generating logs. One other important component of the forest planning process is this delineation of management areas. So these are large geographic areas that are managed under kind of a consistent approach to a given geographic area. And so, for example, these gray areas in here Our wilderness areas, the bluish color areas, are Colorado roadless area. And so those areas would be examples of large geographic areas in the forest plan that wouldn't be consistent with timber harvest objectives. Where in contrast, the areas I have highlighted in red are this general forest and rangelands management area. And so that's where we're going to find most of our suitable timber base. And that's where most of the active forest management is going to occur. And so this general forest and rangeland area covers just less than about half of the Rio Grande National Forest. As we continue to kind of funnel down where we're going to manage at and look at the actual suitable timber base, I can toggle back and forth a little bit, but you'll see that the green areas represent stands that have been gone through that screening process and are part of our suitable timber base. Those generally correspond with the red areas. So I'll toggle back and you can kind of see that where there's red on this slide, it generally corresponds to green underneath it. But there's still white areas in there. And so within a large geographic area, of course, there's non-forested land. So meadows, parks, things like that. There's also, some aspect in elevation combinations where ensuring regeneration after harvest becomes more difficult. So areas like that would be excluded. So as we've narrowed this down, our entire suitable timber base is about, a quarter of our national forest, or about 50% of that general forest and rangelands management prescription. One of the other components that the Rio Grande National Forest has been working through and managing for probably the last 15 years is a large spruce beetle outbreak. And so in our high elevation forest, I'd say most all of our mature Engelmann spruce have been killed. And the spruce fir zone represents about half of our suitable timber base. And so when we take out the spruce fir and we're left with the other commercial species and cover types that we have that haven't been impacted by that bark beetle, we're left with the Douglas fir cover type, lodgepole pine, ponderosa pine, and aspen. And you can see that we've, cut that suitable timber base essentially in half. So, paring that down as we're looking in towards future management, we're left with about 13% of our forest that we would actively manage with any primary purpose for timber production. And so packaging all these concepts together, so the management areas, the suitable timber base, and how that comes together to look at individual projects that we implement on the ground. This map, kind of this, hopefully it's not too hard to see on everybody's screen, but the gray slashed areas represent that management area 5, the general forest and rangeland area. And you can see within that the green, both shades of green, the light green and the dark green, are our suitable timber base. So you can hopefully tell that the suitable timber base is for the most part located in that one management area prescription across the forest. And then looking at an individual project that we have planned right now that's under analysis is kind of outlined in this blue color here. And so you can see that the entire project area is located within management area 5. Within that analysis area for an individual project, it's comprised of some areas that are part of the suitable timber base and some areas that are not. And then the red areas on this inset map show individual treatment units that we have planned. And this particular project happens to be driven for the primary purpose of timber production. And so you can see all the individual units outlined in red on this map are located in the suitable timber base. So they have green underneath that diagonal red crosshatch. some of these stands, and what I have shown in the dark green color is a subset of our suitable timber base that excludes spruce fir and focuses on those live cover types, the four that I highlighted. So Douglas fir, lodgepole pine, ponderosa pine, and aspen, that are on slopes that are generally operable. So, less than 40% kind of on average, and have a site index, which is a general metric of site productivity of more than 55, which for around here puts us on a somewhat productive site, relatively speaking. And if we kind of crosswalk back over to the text here, looking at what we have in green and productive and operable suitable timber base, what we be most likely to manage over the life of our forest plan, which was pretty new. It was signed, put into place in 2020. They're generally good for 15, maybe 20 years. We're looking at about 9% of our forest. And so at a project level, this project combined all those red harvest polygons, total 1,350 acres, which is roughly 2 square miles of harvest area. So depending on your perspective, that might be a lot in context of the entire piece of ground that the Rio Grande National Forest manages. It's a very small percent. We're looking at less than 1% for what this project represents. So that's kind of a summary and framework of where the work occurs, what guides that. And sometimes people are like, hey, there's all these dead trees over there, why don't you log them? Or why are you logging this area? Hopefully that kind of provides that framework to understand the things that we're considering in that. So pivoting then to what types of activities, I've been these into like 3 main types or classes of activities. So we're looking at tree planting, or generally we'll refer to that as reforestation if it occurs on a site that previously had trees on it. We're looking at usually doing that in response to a fire event, or after the completion of a harvest, to either increase tree stocking or sometimes to shift species composition a little bit. The other general class of activity we do here is pre-commercial harvest, and those are usually implemented either with hand thinning activities or mechanized removals. And then the last class would be our commercial harvest, which is usually implemented for a variety of intents and uses a whole host of different harvest and silvicultural systems. So we might be looking at salvage harvesting, maybe improvement cuts, regeneration harvests. There's even age systems, uneven age systems. The silviculture aspect of that, there's probably a whole nother presentation we could have on that. But those are the main categories. So, looking at tree planting, this graph here shows the number of seedlings that we've planted over the last 6 years. And so in case the numbers are hard to read, it generally ranges between like 50 and 90,000 seedlings per year. We took last year off to regroup a little bit, but most of the seedlings here are Engelmann spruce seedlings, and we've been planting those primarily in some of our high elevation burn areas. So like the West Fork and Papoose burn scars, those were fires that burned in 2013. And we've been trying to reestablish some forest cover in those areas. And so the Forest Service here, we use 2 different Forest Service nurseries. One of the nurseries is in Idaho. It's our Lucky Peak nursery. And the other Forest Service nursery we use to grow seedlings for us is our Bessie nursery, which is located in Nebraska. The trees that we grow or I guess that the nursery grows for us, those are all trees that are grown from seed that's been collected locally. And so we have on the forest, there's different seed zones and then elevation bands. So if we collect seed for a certain species out of a seed zone, when we look to replant an area, we make sure that we get seed from the same seed zone and the same elevation band to make sure that we're replanting stock that is, locally native and appropriate for the site that we're planting. And this picture on the screen is a refrigerated semi-trailer that, the trees are shipped under refrigeration. We store them under refrigeration. So each one of these cardboard boxes for Engelmann spruce, we get 300 seedlings in a box, and storing them refrigerated just make sure that they don't try to transpire and become too active and use up carbohydrate reserves before they get put into the ground. Here's a picture of 1-year-old Engelmann spruce seedling. So this is typical for what we planted the last several years. This is a containerized seedling, so it has the soil matrix included with the root plug. The other type of stock that we can plant is a bare root seedling, and so those are shipped. It doesn't have any soil on there. It's just like the name implies, has bare roots on it. Here's a picture. This is some contract planting crews working in a burn area up by Creed. This was burned in 2013. This was in the Papoose burn scar. A couple of years ago, we had a smaller planting project. It was like 5,000 trees, and we wanted to encourage some ponderosa pine, so we just planted those with their own Forest Service employees. This slide is showing what a planted Engelmann spruce seedling looks like. So I guess I can back up and show this tool that we generally use to plant seedlings. It's called a hodad, and so the edges of it are sharp, so you can scrape or scalp the ground to remove competing vegetation, and then you stick that long part into the ground, kind of pivot the handle back and forth, and then you insert the tree plug into the ground, and then just boot back it, so step on it next to it to close up the hole. In terms of the microsite, so planting site selection at a microsite level, if this is the east side of the tree, we're generally looking to have the seedlings planted anywhere from the east side around to the north side of the tree, and that just gives the tree a little bit better shelter from sun and also from some of the prevailing winds. This is an example of a tree that's been doing pretty good. I want to say this is probably about 4 years after this seedling had been planted. So you can see, once they get some roots established, they'll start to grow a decent amount per year. Particularly at our higher elevations, this is an example of some of the struggles and the challenges that we run into. So this is a seedling that was planted in the kind of the monsoon season, so late summer, early fall, and I think the picture was probably taken sometime in December. You can see that it's got a lot of brown needles on it, and what's happening here is at these high elevations, especially when the trees don't get snow cover over them, we'll get some warmer days and some solar radiation reflecting off of the snow. And so the upper part of the tree will start to transpire. And so it's losing moisture while it's trying to photosynthesize, whereas the ground down here where the root zone is frozen. So the top part of the tree is using moisture, transpiring it out to the air, but it's not able to replace it from the soil moisture because it's frozen. And so that has a drying effect. Desiccation, winter desiccation is what it's referred to as. So we can end up with some, either dead tops or sometimes complete mortality. This is an example of, I think this is a Douglas fir that we planted in a burn scar from the Million Fire, which burned in 2002. I want to say this tree was probably planted in 2008. So I think when I took the picture, so it's probably like maybe a 12, 13-year-old tree in this picture. What's I think noteworthy in this one, just pointing out like this little white part on the bottom, that was a tree shelter that we use. So sometimes on a site like this one in the background where there's not a lot of available like natural shade to use, we will sometimes use artificial shade. So sometimes it's these little, circular cones that the tree gets planted and then the shade device gets put over it. Sometimes it's just a flat black card that'll get stood up next to it. Generally we'll remove that shade device. This just happens to be one that we missed, and so the tree grew out of it. So pivoting then to the second kind of class and sequential, like if you're planting trees and growing and tending a stand, we'd be talking about pre-commercial harvest activities. So this graph shows, acres that we've managed with a pre-commercial harvest of one variety or another for the last 6 years. And I'd say generally probably runs between maybe 400 and 1,300 acres a year. These acres are things that we're paying a contractor to accomplish for us, and depending on the type of activity and the intensity of tree removals we're looking at, the cost of this can sometimes range anywhere between $350 and $1,500, or sometimes even more per acre. So you can see that some of this can get pretty expensive pretty quickly. We usually do this to accomplish a variety of objectives. It might be wildlife habitat improvement, fuels reductions, timber stand improvement, or a combination of those different objectives. This is a picture of some of the pre-harvest when we're looking at some areas for pre-commercial harvest or thinning. And this is in our mixed conifer zone. So a Douglas fir stand. So it's got Douglas fir, white fir, probably has, has some aspen in the background, maybe some ponderosa pine. But what's noteworthy here is the brownish tinge that's hopefully shown on the picture there for everybody. That's western spruce budworm. And it's a native insect. It's a defoliator. And around here in our mid elevation band where we have this forest cover type, it seems to be a pretty chronic, long-term persistent problem for us. And this picture really highlights the multi-story stand structure. So we have, large trees, intermediate sized trees, and then these little understory trees. And this stand structure is really favorable for western spruce budworm. Their defense mechanism, if the wind blows them out of a tree, or bird goes after them, anything like that, they bail out and they put a little thread that comes down. So if they start in this overstory tree and they fall out on their little thread, they're going to land on a tree like this. And this tree, you can tell it's had some defoliation over the past just by the dead top and a little bit of the dense condensed crown structure on it. If a budworm falls out of here, lands in this tree and gets scared again, well, then it falls and it still lands on another little tree down here. Where in comparison, if you have an even age stand and we'll say this tree wasn't there and this tree wasn't there, if a budworm falls out, it's just going to land on the ground, and ants and bugs and birds can eat it, or it just doesn't reproduce. So that's kind of the reason behind budworms and multi-story stands. In this photo, it's kind of just showing a dense stocking, a lot of small diameter trees. This, I believe, happens to be in some areas that we, at the time, we're managing to improve bighorn sheep habitat. So for bighorn sheep, their habitat use and effectiveness really relies on a pretty good sight distance so that they can avoid predators. And you can see in a stand with this many stems, you can't see through the stand very far. So then looking at what this types of machinery and what it looks like when it's in action, these are masticators, there's a machine there, and then there's one kind of back here. We typically use like the type of equipment would be described as a vertical shaft rotary axe masticator. It's essentially like a giant lawnmower or brush hog, and they can mow down a tree that's 8 to 10 inches in diameter. So they're, you know, pretty powerful pieces of equipment. This is an example of a treatment that we had in our lower elevation in our pinyon juniper cover type. And, you know, this lands in our big game winter range areas. This particular photo is of a follow-up treatment. So about maybe 15 years after the first treatment here, we're just doing a follow-up to remove some of the pinyon juniper that had encroached. But the objective here was to remove some of the tree cover so that we get better grass in browse and mountain mahogany, so that deer and elk during the winter time have a little bit better feed availability. This is a photo, you know, taken, if you can picture this, you know, being as dense as some of those other stands I showed what they look like before. This is immediately after mastication has been completed. So it looks maybe a little bit rough with the slash and debris on the ground, but you can see it's a much more open stand condition. The slash on the ground, sometimes on these drier sites, helps retain some moisture and has some benefits like that. And we can start to see some better forage availability. And with time, I think this is maybe a few years after we completed mastication in there, you can see that some of the slash kind of weathers and starts to blend in. So the last class of kind of main forest management activity would be our commercial harvest. This graph represents the amount of volume we've sold for the last 6 years. This is in 100 cubic feet of volume is what we measure this in. So, you know, 44,000, 68,000 CCF. For reference, a log truck contains like 12 CCF. So, you know, you take these numbers and divide them by 12. That's the equivalent of how many full-size log truck loads that would be. These numbers also include a little bit of our fieldwood sales, which would be a minor component. The thing to note here is what I was talking about, our salvage program earlier in the spruce beetle mortality. We've really been actively trying to salvage as much of that material as we can. It's gotten to the point now where the material quality has started to degrade, so it's not quite so usable for traditional wood products like dimensional lumber. But there is some demand, but you can see we're starting to transition to a lower volume. Some of this volume here is salvage, but some of it is starting to be comprised of more of our green forest types as we're moving forward. This is a picture of, you know, a typical log landing for a commercial harvest. This happens to be in the winter time, so you know, this, you know, we generally encourage winter operations. We get better soil protection. You know, seedlings are protected by some packed snow. If there's any other, you know, unknown cultural artifacts, things like that, we generally get pretty good protection with that in the winter time. So we encourage that as much as possible. This slide just shows, you know, a whole variety of some summer typical operations. Most of what we're seeing now is mechanized operations. We don't have too many hand fallers anymore, hand falling crews. So most of the trees are cut by heavy equipment, and then they're put into bundles of trees, and then a skidder that has a grapple, basically like big lobster grabbers, will pull a whole bundle of trees down to a landing to be processed. And so, you know, rubber tire skidders, like is shown in this picture here, are the typical ground-based skidder that we'll see here. And this is equipped with a grapple on the back that's just quite shown in this picture. This is just showing, sometimes we're, harvest operations, especially in salvage, where you're moving a lot of volume per acre, it can start to stack up out landings. There's sometimes not enough log truck capacity to haul material as fast as they're generating it. So some of the landing log decks can get big sometimes. Couple pictures here just showing a log truck getting loaded. So the log trucks come in with this back bunk is stacked on the truck so that they can get into the landing easy, get turned around. Once they're facing going out, then the log loader pulls the bunk off and stretches the log truck out. This is a stroke boom delimber. And so what this does is it'll pick up a log at a landing that has all the branches on it, and it pulls it through and strips off all the branches, and then it has a saw on the head, so then it can cut logs to different lengths, and then it'll pivot and put them into decks. This is, I think, just showing some examples of after a salvage harvest in a stand where we've had a lot of residual green trees. If there's a lot of trees out there that are green, the loggers and operators that we have around here typically do a fantastic job of protecting all the residual trees. And so if there's a lot there to start with, there's generally, quite a bit left after the fact. And this is kind of making that same point. Some of the stands, though, I couldn't find any pictures of them, but if there's a lot of basically like 100% mortality in the overstory, of course, those are going to look a lot more open after we're done. And that was the last slide that I had. So I did have one more video, if I can get it to work for you guys. It shows in one other setup for the commercial operations instead of a stroke boom delimber. Some of the guys are getting towards stop sharing. They're moving to in the woods processing, so it's a processor head. So the head on the piece of equipment will cut the tree, lean it over, run it through a set of roller wheels that delimbs the tree, and then that same head cuts that tree into log lengths. And they're pretty impressive pieces of equipment. Yeah, so that's all I had. Hopefully folks have some questions.
Yeah, Greg had one. How does the delimbing machine know where to cut off the log?
Oh yeah, so they're calibrated. So like the stroke boom, and they'll know, they'll reset it at the end of the log, so then it knows how far it spits the boom out. And so they can cut them off at certain lengths. Those processor heads, the video I just showed, those again, I think most of those will work with like a little laser system. So they'll, feed, so it'll sense where the end of that log is. And then it knows how far it feeds in based on how much the feed wheels spin on it. So it can sense both length, and then it also, those can sense diameter too. So those can be programmed so that, an operator is, cutting a certain length. And then also if they get below a certain diameter of a log, it'll cut it off at a certain diameter also. So, I mean, they're pretty impressive pieces of equipment to have a lot of components. I think just the processor head on those, even for a used one, I'm probably not the most expert to tell you, but from what I've heard, they're like $300,000 plus just for the processor head part.
We had a question from Frank. He said, we have seen old leftover log decks. Why does that happen?
So that's a good question. Without, knowing the specific log deck, some of the scenarios where that might happen, sometimes if we have a sale where we're looking to salvage dead Engelmann spruce, if there's a little bit of an off species like aspen included that needs to be cut for operational purposes, like making a landing location or skid trail routes. Sometimes that material that isn't included in the contract, we'll have them bring it down and just deck it and leave it there. Most of the time we'll try to make that available for firewood cutters after the fact, if we can. I'm trying to think of other scenarios where it might actually get left. Potentially, if there's, some of the large sales where we've, there's a lot of material coming out. If there's just a partial load when somebody's done with the sale, where it's just like a quarter of a log truck load, here and a quarter over there, it's tough for them to economically get that out. So that might be one of the other scenarios that you might see some log decks sitting around after a timber sale has actually been completed and is closed out. So I don't know, Frank, if that might fit any of the scenarios that you've seen, or if you're talking about some much larger log decks that are left. But
would sometimes the slash piles be stacked looking similar to log decks, or do they tend to pile that up in like more of like a sort of teepee style?
No, so depending on the type of equipment that they use, like those stroke boom delimbers, they'll end up being a pretty dense, compact pile, and sometimes they'll use a small bulldozer or their skidder to really push those up. So those will be pretty obvious, like a kind of a giant dome teepee looking pile. But sometimes with the processor heads, like that feed wheel type system, some of the operators don't actually process in the woods with those. They'll have one of those sitting at the landing, so a skidder will bring in a bunch of logs, trees. Then when they process those, they'll kind of spit out the tops, and sometimes those can end up being somewhat oriented similarly, and it's not generally such a big like high pile. Could be that too. Yeah.
And Greg also asked if the log is too long, can they put it on the truck? Or what's the length they could be?
Oh, I know some of the guys will haul like 50-foot logs.
Wow.
Yeah.
Dang.
I think typical though, like the longer ones are like 41, 42-foot logs. Sometimes they'll get some longer logs on there. And then of course, like intermixed, I mean, the people that load the log trucks are, I mean, pretty skilled individuals. They'll take long logs, like for the, what we normally see hauled here is log length logs. But of course, when you're bucking a tree into different lengths, like not everything makes a perfect length log. So you end up with, 8, 10, 12-foot pieces of tree. And so they'll lay down what they call bunk logs to make a bed on the bottom of that log truck. And then, they'll fit in all these shorter pieces and, build all the way around it. And it's pretty neat to watch them. They can do it pretty quickly.
Cherry picking 1,000-pound trees and things like that onto a truck. I think it's neat to watch.
Yeah.
Talk about real quick before we go on to Doug's question. The weight of those log trucks. I would have no idea how much they're weighing when they come off the forest. It's like 20 feet high or something like that.
Yeah. So most of the time they're restricted to the state restriction, which is 85,000 pounds for like non-interstate
Class
highways.
B highways, right?
Yeah. Yep.
So how do they know it's 80,000 pounds?
Yeah, so that most of the log trucks are equipped with some sort of like a log truck based scale. So as long as they're parked on a fairly level landing, they have a readout under their truck, so they can get pretty close. Of course, it's not like a certified scale, so if you ran it over an actual certified scale, it's probably not going to be exact, but it gets them pretty close in the ballpark to know how much weight they have on a log truck. I think most of the log trucks, the tear weight, so the empty weight of a log truck, is usually like maybe between 22 and 24,000 pounds. So we're looking at 55,000 pounds of payload on it for logs.
Oh, that's cool. I didn't know they had scales on them. That's cool, Kevin. Thank you.
Yep.
Can you see Doug's question in the chat there?
Or I can read it out. So Doug asked, what are climate models forecasting for the forest on the Rio Grande National Forest? For example, are the Engelmann spruce forest acres reducing?
That actually sounds like a great question for Doug to answer. I want to say this, with the climate models, we can use like a whole spectrum of different forecast projections of how much the climate might warm. I think with the kind of the middle of the road models, it does show definitely change in distribution of species. And I think the spruce fir zone is shown to contract a little bit over time if some of those models hold. But Doug, if you wanted to elaborate more on what you've seen with that, I know you're more familiar with some of those models.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Some of the reports that I've read is indicating a reduction in acres for the future, and so I kind of know the answer, but I just thought maybe I would ask that out to see if you've seen some other information too.
No, I haven't seen anything, that counters that, Doug. I think, with the spruce fir, generally, compared to like a lodgepole pine, which spruce fir naturally tends to be a more uneven age stand structure in most settings compared to like a lodgepole pine type tends to be more an even age system reset by large fire, and then it regenerates all at the same time. And I think that's one of the good things that we have going for us here with our spruce fir is even with the heavy mortality that we've had from spruce beetle of the mature trees, underneath those trees there's already pretty well established advanced regeneration, and so that gives it a leg up for this next rotation, so it's not having to struggle with some of those seedlings that I showed pictures of, where to actually get them established is sometimes the most difficult part, but once they get established they're able to withstand a little bit more intense weather and climatic swings. So I think for our next rotation, I think that's one thing that is on the positive side for us here.
Yeah, that's that is a good point. The fires that had gone through are gonna definitely extend the regeneration rate of those spruce forests in a longer time scale versus the spruce bark beetle mortality sites that didn't have the fire event. So
Yeah.
it's pretty fascinating stuff for sure.
Oh, it is. Yeah. Well, I know we're running one more minute, so I'll try to squeeze this in, but it's just a neat observation that, Doug mentioned some of our fires. One of the things that we've been seeing is aspen establishing from seed in some of those burn areas. So, I think the more prevailing wisdom used to be that, aspen just regenerates from suckering response from existing root structure and doesn't really regenerate from seed. The regenerate from root suckering definitely holds true, but we've definitely seen more establishment from seed than I think we would have expected, based on some of the more prevailing wisdom, even like 20 years ago. So it's kind of neat to see that.
Always neat to see more aspens, right?
Mhm.
I love it. So, all right, well, let's give it one last check on immediate questions, and if there's nothing immediately prevailing, keep thinking about them if you have them, and then we're going to pass it over to Hannah to see who's going home with fabulous prizes today. I hope it's me. I never win.
Okay, well, thank you all for joining, and thanks Kevin for sharing all of that information. It was great. If you're interested in other programs like this, we have recorded all our past year's presentations, so you can find those on YouTube. This one will also be up there. And then next month for our Forest Specialist series, we'll have Meg Shelley talking about our forest stock program. So that's all our four-legged workers. We'll be right back here on Zoom at 5 p.m. on Wednesday, March 15th. So we hope to see you there. Our door prize winner this month is Deborah McLean. So I've been in touch with her about getting her door prize. So thank you all for joining us. And again, if you'd like to be kept in the loop about future programs, please send me your email and I will add it to our mailing list. And thanks again, Kevin, for coming on. It was excellent. We really appreciate it. I hope you all enjoy your evening.